Is the religion business docuseries worth watching? I watched all 7 hours yesterday at release so that I can help you answer that question and help you to know what to expect. So if you've been interested in what this docuseries is all about, I am going to give you my initial thoughts and early review in this video. And I'm also going to be reviewing and reacting to every episode over the coming week. And I'll probably have a much better review and some deeper thoughts after I watch it again and I sit with it for a little while. So I'll probably do another video in a week or two, but today I want to give you my first kind of unfiltered initial thoughts about the religion business docuseries. So let's get into it. So for this video, I want to look at a couple of things. One, where did they crush this docuseries? Where did they do things really well? And what were those things that they did really well? But also, not just where did they crush it, where might they have crashed it? Where are there things that maybe I wasn't happy with, or I wish they had done a little bit different, or things that may cause a concern to some people who are watching? But also, I want to check on some of the most common concerns that I heard leading up to this docuseries, because I had a lot of people I know who were really interested in watching it. I also had a lot of people who were really concerned about it. So we're going to look at some of those concerns that I heard most, and we're going to ask the question, after watching it, do those concerns really hold water? And if so, why? And then we'll finish with some highlights from the show, some things that really kind of stand out to me after sleeping on that first watch, and where I land after watching the whole thing. But let's start out with the good, okay? What are the really good things that stood out? Where did they crush this documentary? And I want to start out with this. It is packed full, guys, of fantastic and honest conversations. I mean, these are real conversations, but they're not just real conversations. They're conversations with experts like theologians, biblical scholars, historians, tax experts, law experts, pastors, nonprofit leaders, research leaders, academics, and guys, they even include someone whose interview actually came from being annoyed and frustrated with some posts that Nathan Apfel had made on the religion business Instagram, on social media. So not all of these interviews are people who agreed with Nathan or people who liked Nathan. Some of them are people who were pushing back, right? And I think that is really cool, and I think that is a very interesting conversation to watch, but you're going to hear a lot more about that conversation as we go on. But all of those interviews and all of the conversations, to me, they felt authentic, and I thought they were helpful. It was really cool to see the open dialogue, and I enjoyed seeing real time some people who he was interviewing wrestling over some of these seemingly simple issues. Like there were times where you would see someone be like, "Oh, I think this answer is easy," and then you'd watch them wrestle through how complex it really is and some of the nuances of it. So I think that is really cool to be able to watch in real time. It's also a reminder to me that when people who disagree, when we stop attacking each other and we stop having spats on social media like Russell B. Johnson did with Nathan Apfel a couple weeks ago, when we stop doing that and instead we get knee to knee and we get eye to eye in good faith, that anger that we often have at the beginning, it tends to turn to curiosity, and the conversations tend to go in ways that grow and challenge and encourage both parties, even if we started with a major disagreement. And when you think about these interviews, one thing that stood out to me that I thought they did a really good job with is these aren't schlups, guys. The show is packed with expert, experienced, and insider voices. So these are some really cool voices, and they really run throughout the show. So a lot of the people you hear from in episode 1, you're going to hear from all throughout. You're going to pick up other voices, but once you hear from a voice, you generally are going to hear from them for the rest of the show, and that thread just kind of runs from episode to episode, which I thought was very helpful and very cool. Also, just kind of thinking about the show as a whole, they take a pretty big and holistic purview, okay? So essentially, they're not just talking about one brand of Christianity, one denomination, or one doctrine, or one approach, and it's not just about churches either, okay? So this really, I thought, it helped me to zoom out of my own little box, because we all have our own little box that we're in, how we think about church. It helped me zoom out of that and to see a much bigger purview of these issues than even I would normally take, and normally taking more of a 30,000-foot view. So I think for people, it's really helpful. At the same time, as you walk into this, know this isn't just talking about one expression of Christianity. And at times, they're going to talk about things like, for instance, the LDS church. And I know there's going to be a lot of Christians who go, well, I don't consider that church. And again, they're just taking a very big, broad look at this. And they're really looking through a lot of that legal definition of what is a church and what is a Christian church. Another thing that really stuck out to me, each episode did a really good job, I thought, of ending in a way that made me want to keep watching. Now, I've watched a lot of docuseries, especially about the church, and sometimes there are some real stinkers of episodes. And I thought you got a good episode 1 and a good final episode, but I thought in the middle, those episodes just kept getting better, man. They kept getting better, kept building. And every time it got done, even though I was tired and, there was a lot of reasons not to watch, I kept wanting to watch because it always felt like we were moving into another story. I wanted to know what was going on. So very entertaining, and I do appreciate that. Another thing that they do that I thought was really cool in the docuseries, they expose, I think it's 8, it may not be 8, but I think it's 8 loopholes in churches and religious nonprofits that are often used in ways that should give us a lot of concern about money and that lead to some, potentially nefarious things. The fact that these loopholes exist or that a church uses them doesn't necessarily mean that bad things are going on or criminal things are going on. But these are loopholes that we probably need to close, even if it's just ourselves as the church, and say, hey, we're not going to engage in some of these things because of the appearance of impropriety, right? We want to be above reproach. We want to do everything that we can to make sure that people see us as above reproach, okay? And I think most people, in a vacuum, if we're in a vacuum, I think most people would agree that these 8 loopholes they talk about, they need to be looked at and they need to be addressed in some way or another. And I also think that the information they share about these loopholes, it's important stuff that the average Christian wouldn't know. The average Christian is going to be surprised, I think, by a lot of these things. There's going to be things that you know, but there's going to be a lot that you've never thought of, you've never heard of. And I think it's very helpful to these conversations. I also thought they did a really good job of asking questions and giving people a chance to respond and talk. Like these kind of churches they were asking, these church leaders that they were doing stories on, I thought they gave them a chance to respond and talk without being overly aggressive or cynical. Now, they're definitely cynical. There's definitely some bias, like with a lot of these pastors and churches. When they call, they had already looked into things. They already had concerns. But instead of just assuming you're completely guilty and there's no answer here, I thought they did a pretty good job of being as open as possible to let's have a conversation, even though a lot of people didn't want to talk about them, okay? It didn't want to talk to them. And you're actually going to see quite a few people who agreed to talk to them throughout the docuseries only to cancel at the last minute. Like when they're already there, people are canceling because I don't know if it's fear that caused them to cancel or if it's someone else they knew that called them and said, hey, don't talk to these guys. But it's pretty wild. There are some people, some kind of big names that it looked like we're going to talk to them. And I was really excited to see how they would answer some of these questions, how they would handle leaning into the tension, but then they didn't. But I appreciated the way that they reached out to people and at least just, even if you don't think it's good faith, I didn't think it was overly cynical or aggressive. They weren't trying to do gotcha journalism the whole time. There were some just good conversations of, hey, here's what we're doing. We're going to be honest. We would love to talk to you about this. Here's some of the concerns. And it gave people an opportunity to respond if they wanted to. In my opinion, not enough pastors and church leaders took advantage of that. Not enough at all. And I think you'll agree when you see it. I thought this was pretty cool. And I don't know, maybe this isn't crushing it, but I thought it was pretty cool. Nathan donates to every single ministry that they go on site to question, and he donates on camera before he questions that person. I've heard horror stories from people where they're like, man, they would just take a film crew and they would ambush these churches. And usually the film crew, from everything that I saw, it's different camera people each time, but usually the crew is Nathan and one camera person. And one of the things I appreciated was from everything that we saw in the footage, they always acted respectfully in the church services and while they were in the church buildings. If they wanted to talk to a church or ask questions, they were going to go in, go through the service, be respectful, wait until after it was over to ask questions. And usually the only camera that was on while they were in the building was Nathan's glasses. So he just had on glasses. Nobody knew there was a camera going, so they weren't distracting people. And I appreciated that, because when you got people who come in guns blazing, huge camera crew, or they're trying to interrupt church services, it makes a lot of sense why people get upset and why they get aggressive. So I appreciated that they didn't do that. They came in to ask a lot of questions, but they were respectful while they were in services and while they were in the building. Now, a lot of people like to paint them out as bad actors and say, hey, when they visit these churches, they're doing all these kind of these bad things. They're causing a ruckus. They're causing a disturbance. And I just wanted to say I didn't see that in the footage, and I appreciated that because I've heard so much about it. I was worried I might see some of that in the footage and that it would kind of get in the way of these questions that they're asking. I didn't think it did at all. So I was glad to see that. I thought the questions they asked were good. And every single episode, y'all, every episode had some things that surprised me. Every episode had some things that frustrated me with the system. And every episode had things that challenged me and made me ask questions. So again, there were really no duds here, okay? The conversation keeps going. You're thinking the whole time, and I think it spawns great conversation. So if you're watching this with someone, or you got a friend who's watching it, I got a couple of friends who are going to start watching it. And I can't wait until they do so that we can have some of these conversations. Outside of just the content, guys, it looks phenomenal. Like the look, they did a great job of just producing the show. It's very entertaining to watch. And one thing that I appreciated, this is just super practical. Well, I don't want to give too much away, but you literally get to see the connections that they're making, and you get to see, like visually, the case for reform that gets built right in front of you. And once you watch it, you're going to see exactly what I'm talking about. It's going to make a lot more sense. But they don't just tell you this through interviews, but you actually, by the time you get to the end, you're going to see it kind of all laid out, which is super helpful for me as kind of a visual learner. And I love the way that came out in the end. And then kind of the final thing that I have to say, hey, they did really well. I thought they did a good job of not just pointing out problems, okay? Because this docuseries could have been 7 episodes, 7 hours of just pointing out problems and issues and all that. But I thought they did a good job of also highlighting consistently nonprofits and churches who are doing things well. They interviewed people who are doing things well, and they asked them tough questions as well, but these were people who were willing to be really open and honest with them. It was really cool seeing people who are doing their best to make a difference, who are doing their best to be transparent throughout the show so that it wasn't just negative the whole time. Now, so it's a lot of good stuff. I really enjoyed my first watch through of this show, but at the same time, it was not perfect. I've got some concerns. I got some places where I go, hey, maybe crashed it is a bad way of looking at it, but I would say, you know what? You didn't land that the way I would have loved to have seen you land that. And look, I have had Nathan Atfeld and Chris Ayub on the show a couple of different times. I've even texted Nathan today. I think he did a great job with the docuseries, but you guys know I'm always going to be honest, and I'm going to share with you when I have some concerns. And there are some concerns. There are some warnings that I kind of want to give you because I've recommended this docuseries saying, hey, I hadn't watched it before yesterday, but I think it's going to be really good conversations. I've encouraged our community and our audience to watch it. So I want to be honest with you about some of the concerns, some of the places where I think they crashed it a little bit, okay? And none of these are deal breakers, but I think they're important to talk about. One, and it's not huge to me, but I know it's going to be huge to some people, okay? And I just want you to know about this. There is some language. It's not a lot. It's not all the time, but there's some language and some framing in a few places where they frame different stories or different viewpoints that I think run the risk of disengaging part of the audience. But again, it isn't all the time, but it's just kind of a thread. It runs throughout. So you're going to see it, probably about once an episode. Maybe there's some where it's not an episode, but there's a couple of others. But again, it's things that are said or the way that they're said that I think run the risk of disengaging part of the audience. So if you struggle with cursing, there's not a lot of cursing, but there's going to be an F-bomb. There's just going to be some words that are going to jolt you all of a sudden. They're very few and far between. I wish that in most of those cases, if not all of those cases, they had just bleeped it out, okay? Because I think that would have got the same point across without running the risk of disengaging some Christians who maybe are bothered by that, but still need to see this. And I'm going to encourage you, even if you are bothered by that, go in knowing there's a little bit of it. There's not a lot of it. I would still encourage you to watch and not turn it off. But at the same time, if you feel convicted about that and that bothers you, I completely understand. So to me, and again, I don't think it's terrible. I just think it gave needless ammo to people who already want to discredit Nathan and Chris. So if you got a Christian friend who wants to discredit them, or a church leader or a pastor, they may watch it and go, you know what? I've heard they use a bunch of language, and it's not a bunch of language. But if they can use, hey, I heard they use language, you shouldn't watch this. It's just a needless kind of club that you put in people's hands. None of it's terrible. But again, it just seemed easily avoidable to me. And I want as many people to watch this and engage with this documentary and the conversations from it as possible. So if it had been me, I would have rather seen some of those things left out or bleeped out. But again, it's not terrible. Another place where I would have liked to have seen things happen a little differently, I would have liked to have seen better sourcing. This is something I've talked to some people about behind the scenes. In my first interview with Nathan and Chris, I asked them for the sources on a couple of stats and things so I could go check into them. And guys, full disclosure, every time I've asked for something, because I asked for something the other day because I said, hey, I think as soon as people watch this, they're going to ask some questions about the stat. Where did you get it? Nathan has been phenomenal to get it to me. So I've never seen him hiding anything. He shared those sources. But one of the things that he said in our first interview was he said, hey, when this comes out, we're going to share all of our sources in the show and on the website. And they do. But here's an example of what I'm talking about, where I wish this would have been a little better. Some of the data that experts are sharing, and these are experts sharing it, but it might be labeled in the show as they share something, they give the number, and then under it, it says something like 2020 data instead of saying 2020 data from X survey or from X study, or, go to the website for more details. And so I would have liked to have seen a little bit better sourcing, because when you don't give those sources, it leaves things open to reproach. It leaves things open to people mislabeling your data and saying, oh, that's bad data, to misinterpreting the data, or just generally questioning and challenging the data. And I think questioning and challenging data is good. When you give those sources, you tell people exactly where to look. I think it's another place to just take the club out of their hand. But I don't think that they're trying to hide anything, because they've given me every source that I've asked for. So whether it was on the screen that they gave a little more detail, or it was on the website, I had just hoped for better data that people were going to be able to check and confirm, because I know there are going to be people who want to check and confirm all these pieces of data. And hopefully that's going to be added later, because I looked at the website, I didn't see it, but I could have missed it. And hopefully it's going to be added later, but that was a concern. One of the places, and this is hard to say because it's not terrible. I both love it and hate it. But one of the places where I feel like they crashed it a little bit was the ending. And I'm not talking about the last episode. The last episode's really good, but I kept looking at the timer on the show and thinking, there's not enough time to wrap this up well. Like, I feel like we're just going to have to wrap this up really fast. And they did a good job of wrapping it up. But when I think about the ending, I slept for a little bit after watching all this. And when I woke up, that was the first thing I was thinking about was, man, I'm not sure how I feel about the ending, because I both love it and I hate it at the same time. And it just feels, and again, I don't want to get into too much detail. I will when I review that at the end. I want to give everybody a chance to watch it without spoiling it. But I feel like there was more to be had there. And a good ending and a good final episode. I thought there was more to be had there. And I thought there were just some big opportunities that were missed that did not have to be missed. I would have liked to have also heard more about the solutions, like the Broken Shepherds app in the docuseries. They illustrated the problems and concerns really well, but it felt like the potential solutions that I know they've got, I know they've worked on, and I know they talk about, it felt like those fell a little bit flat. And even though there are some good ones out there, and like I said, they put a ton of money and effort and expert man hours into the development of a resource to help address this problem with the Broken Shepherds app, but I just didn't think that they talked about it enough in the docuseries. So if a person isn't already aware of that app, they haven't listened to the other interviews, they're not looking on the website, then I think you can leave going, okay, I agree there's a problem. I definitely agree I can be a part of the change. I want to be a part of the change. and then still say, but I'm not sure what I should do next to be a part of helping the church, to be a part of pushing for a transparent church. And I would have really liked to have seen that. I think it was just a missed opportunity. Now, this one's kind of small, and this is not going to affect everybody. But again, my fear is always, hey, is there anything that's going to keep someone from watching this all the way through? And I don't just think this will affect a ton of people, but we all have different personality types, and I think this could impact some. So I want to let you know. So hopefully, if you feel this, you can work through it a little bit. Even though I think they masterfully, for the most part, kept the threads of a lot of really big stories. They kept them connected and they kept them moving really, really smoothly through the episodes. For some of a kind of our audience and community, for some people who are like really logical, really linear thinkers, like you want things in a row, you want things in order, it may be a little hard to follow at times because the stories and the interviews, they bounce around a lot. Okay. Now, again, I didn't have much of an issue with this, but I do know some friends who are very linear thinkers, and I think it may be a struggle for them to at times make the connections that are there. And that could be especially an issue if a person's watching with days in between episodes, because if you're not watching it back to back or you got a few days in between, it may be more easy to miss the connections that way. Okay, so if you're a super linear logical thinker, you may want to have a notepad and take some notes as you watch through. But I think for most people, it's probably not going to be an issue. But that is something I was a little bit worried about at one point, and I thought just with moving some things around a little bit, it might have been a little bit easier. But again, I think for most people, it's not going to be an issue. A couple of other small things. I hoped to actually see the docuseries talk a little bit more about topics like NDAs and hush money payments that are used to silence people. And I wanted to see those discussed a little bit more. So I felt like that was a bit of a missed opportunity. But at the same time, guys, that is 7 hours jam packed. They were moving through, they talked about a bunch of stuff. So we can continue to have those conversations. And hopefully we'll be getting the green light from our attorneys even today to be able to start sharing some stuff with you soon. Some things that we've been working on, a project to help tackle that NDA problem. But again, I would have just liked to have seen a little bit more about that. Also, Nathan's interview, and this is small potato stuff, but Nathan interviews some nonprofit leaders in Uganda throughout a couple of episodes, and I thought those conversations were awesome, guys. Loved them. My only worry was for some people who are going to be watching, if you've never been, and like it wasn't a problem for me, I've spent time in Uganda. These people are speaking really good English, but sometimes because of their accent, I worried that some people may have a little bit of a difficulty understanding them without subtitles or captions. And I didn't see a way to turn those on watching it through the website. I may have missed it. It may just be me being totally technologically just kind of ignorant, but I didn't see that. And that was something I was a little bit worried about because some people may have a hard time kind of, understanding that. And then just kind of probably the last couple of things, the call to action, just kind of at the end where I think there was a great spot for that call to action. And again, attaching it to the Broken Shepherds app. I felt like that fell a little bit flat. I would have liked to have seen a little bit clearer of a CTA and challenge for some practical ways the viewers can take next steps and get involved in bringing positive change. But when we get to the end of the last episode, I am going to give all of you some more practical steps that I'm thinking through, and I'm going to try my best to do that. But overall, I think they did a good job, and I think you're going to be encouraged to ask some questions, have these conversations, and be a part of positive change when you get done. And like I said, overall, I really enjoyed this docuseries. I felt like probably the biggest change they could have made that would just take this over the top, total A+. I think probably another 10 to 15 minutes of intentionality in the final episode would have made a massive impact. But as it goes, man, I would give this probably a solid B+. I really, really enjoyed it. I think the conversations are great. That grade may get a little higher, a little lower after I watch it the next time. But I highly, highly recommend you watching this. If you're a Christian, if you're a pastor, you're a parishioner, I think these are just really important conversations for Christians to have, regardless of what parts you agree with Nathan on or you disagree on. And I think the more of us that are having these conversations, the better. Now, a few highlights that I want to note, some things that I really just stuck out to me from this. And again, after sleeping on this a little bit, these are the things I'm remembering. One thing that you see church staff repeat throughout the different episodes, they tend to repeat in a lot of different ways that they just don't have to answer questions and they have no obligation to answer questions. We don't have to answer that. And man, I was just so let down by the amount of church leaders who said that, because all I kept thinking was, you're right that you don't have to answer it, but what's the downside to answering it? Because as church leaders, we're called to be above reproach, and we cannot be above reproach if we refuse to answer questions. I also just thought, man, if if you have people making a documentary like this, and they ask you really tough questions and you just answer them openly and honestly, and you have good explanations and there's nothing to hide, then the reality is there's no story here, right? So the best way for these churches to kind of cut through the tension would have been to answer some simple questions. But even when they chose not to answer, I thought one of the worst ways to choose not to answer is to say over and over, we don't have to answer your questions. Everybody knows you don't have to answer their questions, but the real question is, why would you not answer their questions? Should you answer their questions? And I think when people ask questions, especially donors, and Nathan donated to all these ministries, I think that we should get answers. Even if it's not as deep of answers as we want, I think they should do their best to give us those answers. And I really appreciate pastors who handle questions well. We always say around here, you can tell more about how a church handles your questions. You can tell more about their health by how they handle your questions than you can about anything else. Okay. So that really stuck out to me, how many times at different churches, different places all across the country, at even different ministry events, that thread, that theme kept coming up. Now, they talk a lot as well, not only about like questions about how the money is misused or how money is hidden, but I appreciated that throughout the docuseries, they talk a lot about the impact the money given by Christians through the church and through ministries. They talk a lot about how the massive impact that this can make if we just had some better controls and protections in place. So this isn't just, hey, let's bash the church, let's ask a lot of tough questions about money, but it's also, hey, the church is in a position to change the world in a way that no other organization, no other government can. And that inspires me, because that is exactly, I think, what Jesus had in mind, that we would have as the body of Christ more of an impact on the world than anybody else or any other organization on the planet. Now, I also, when I just think about all this, the churches, to me, the churches, the nonprofits, the religious, nonprofits, the people and organizations who look the worst, like the ones who look the worst, they were the ones who acted out. So the worst stuff, like from my vantage point, the worst stuff was not the questions that Nathan asked. The worst stuff, the most uncomfortable stuff, was the way that churches wilded out at times in response to some pretty simple questions. Now, they were uncomfortable at times, but there was no reason to wild out and act out the way that they did. Like you literally see in this docuseries, you see across episodes, you see Nathan get kicked out of events, get kicked out of churches, get kicked off church property. He gets trespassed, he gets arrested, he gets threatened, all by churches and ministers and church leaders. And it's just not what you would expect. And it's a really bad look, I think, for the church. Now, as well, people and pastors, both on and off the show. Now, I've heard this for over a year now. A lot of people and pastors want to talk about Nathan's bias, and they want to talk about his intentions. Okay. So they'll just say, hey, he's got a negative bias. His intention is just to hurt the church, all kinds of stuff like that. And they're trying to dismiss the documentary before it comes out. And I've heard this time and time again from people that even I respect, know, and love. Yet, I would say this. A lot of these pastors and people who would say those things have had the opportunity to shut down. And I'm talking about people a little bit more specifically who are on the show or who are connected to people who are on the show. They had the opportunity to shut down the stories about them and the people they know and rise above any bias that they thought Nathan had with open and honest conversation. And I think Nathan and them would have been cool with it, but it would have been great to have on camera, hey, you're asking to have a conversation with me. I would absolutely love to have a conversation with you. Can we also stream that live just so we don't have to worry about it being like, deceptively edited later? But they didn't even do that. A lot of this stuff would have looked better and went away with open and honest conversation, as long as they didn't have something to hide. But I just think about it this way. If they don't like the story, if people inside the church didn't like the story or don't like the story that Nathan was telling, the best way to stop it would be to lean into the tension and have an open and honest conversation. Like I said, unless you have something to hide. So the amount of people who refused open and honest conversations, I don't think they expose Nathan's bias as much as it looks like they have something to hide. And I wish more pastors, especially the ones that said, hey, we want to meet with you, and then canceled at the last minute, I wish that more had actually met with him. And then kind of the final thing as we finish up this video and this review, I want to talk about some of the biggest concerns that I heard. And let's just ask this question: did they hold water? Okay, and we talked about one with the bias here a minute ago, but I want to share some other concerns that I heard from multiple people, and all of these I've heard from multiple people in different ways. So let's just talk about these. And now that I've watched it, if someone brings me these concerns, what would I tell them? Would I tell them this is a legitimate concern in my opinion, or no? And why is that? So the first concern that I've heard a lot is, I heard some people who have said after some interviews and stuff, man, we just don't like his data. We don't like his data. I've heard that we tried to look into some of his data, and Jeff, they're estimates. They're not factual data. They're not research. They're estimates. And how can you make these big claims like $890 billion coming into the church and $53 billion being stolen annually? How can you make these big claims based off estimates? But when you watch the show, they actually answer to that, I think, because they're talking about, especially when you've got one of kind of the accounting experts who's talking about the Widow's Mite report, for instance. He says, these are the best estimates. They're based on models that were checked over and over again by experts. These are the best, most accurate estimates and models that we can have. The only way that we can get better and go beyond estimates, the only way that we can get closer is if churches disclose this data. Because right now we're having to look and investigate and piece together everything we can pull, but a lot of this is still hidden. So yes, they are estimates, but there is no way to move beyond estimates unless churches actually get open and share this information publicly. Okay, so as long as it is kept private, that's going to be the best that we can do. But again, these are reasonable models. These are checked by experts. And the reason why those are estimates is because the churches simply refuse to release the public data. So these are estimates that are based off all of the available data. And if they're wrong, and if churches don't like them, again, then transparent public disclosures would fix that. So if you don't like them, you think people are wrong, let's get transparent. Let's tell them what the real data actually is. But absent of that, you have some of these experts who talk about it and say, this is the best data and the best numbers that we're going to get unless these churches open up their books, okay? Another concern that I heard from some people was, hey, we think he's using some bad stats. Like, in an interview with us, they mentioned like 44,000 denominations. There's all these denominations. And the reality is there's a ton of Christian denominations. At the same time, there are a lot of problems with that 44,000 denominations mark. The way that it counts denominations, I think that it counts every single non-denominational church as its own denomination. So it's misleading, okay? And I totally get that. But and I may be missing this here because I watched it pretty fast and then have slept since then. But I don't remember any of those bad statistics that people have asked about. And they're like, man, what if he's just sharing statistics like that all the way throughout the documentary? I don't remember any of those. I may be missing them. I'm going to listen a lot closer as I go through the second time. I'll watch each episode again. But I don't remember any of those. But concerning the statistics that people pushed on from other interviews, they didn't seem to be, those kind of stats didn't seem to be a big part of this docuseries. Also, Nathan wasn't sharing hardly any stats that an expert hadn't shared already. So when you're hearing a stat, you're hearing it from someone who has expertise in that field. So all that data, it looked like it came from experts who were involved in various interviews. These aren't untrustworthy people off the street. These are people with background in these areas, and I think pretty trustworthy stats and data throughout. Now, one of the other big concerns, and I've heard this from multiple people, they had a lot of questions and concerns about Nathan's theology, his doctrine, and his status as a Christian. They wanted to ask a bunch of questions. I asked him questions about his view of the inspiration of the Bible. I asked him questions about if he went to church. I asked him questions in our interviews, and there were people who just said, man, I didn't like his answer. I wanted you to ask him more and more and more. And guys, I never felt like Nathan's, just watching this documentary, I never felt like Nathan's theology or doctrine was pushed. I didn't feel like he was pushing his agenda as far as theology or doctrine, or really anyone's for that matter. The questions that he asked were really broad questions that connect broadly to Christianity, beyond specific doctrinal expressions. And one of the ways that we see that is he could talk about a charismatic church, he could talk about a non-denominational megachurch, and he could talk about the LDS church all at the same time. And most of us would say, God, those are so different. There's huge doctrinal errors between them, stuff like that. It's a lot of things people could fight over, yet he would talk about them in the same breath because the conversations they were having were these bigger conversations. Now, Nathan isn't overtly Christian in this docuseries. There's things he says to where it legitimately will make you ask, I wonder what he really believes. I also didn't think he was overtly antagonistic, like against Christianity or overtly antagonistic, and you can 100% say I'm not a Christian. I think there's just a lot of questions people may have, but I don't know that those questions matter, because regardless of his doctrine, regardless of his faith, regardless of whether you get the answers you want, the questions he asks in this docuseries are valid questions that Christians need to wrestle with and look into. And that's something I said before the docuseries, and I feel even more confident about saying it now. Even if it was an atheist who made this docuseries, I don't think that it invalidates the questions at all. But again, I don't think he was overtly antagonistic. He wasn't really pushing any specific doctrine throughout, and I didn't feel like anybody was. One thing that I heard before the docuseries a ton is, oh, come on, Jeff, this docuseries is going to come out. This guy just wants churches to lose their nonprofit status. This guy doesn't want nonprofits to be a thing, and he wants all churches to lose their nonprofit and tax-free status. And guys, I never once heard that throughout all of my conversations with him before, but now after watching the whole docuseries, I never heard that. I never got that through all of it. The concerns and the questions, to me, were centered around accountability and transparency. They weren't that nonprofits are bad or churches are bad. There were questions about, hey, why are some organizations considered churches when they're obviously not churches, which I think is a valid question. And why are churches not filling out things like 990s? Why are churches not being as transparent as other nonprofits? And what would happen if, look at all the good that would happen if these nonprofits just got more transparent? And actually, out of the people that he interviewed, multiple of them talked about the importance. None of them said nonprofits are bad. None of them said nonprofits should lose their tax status or that churches shouldn't be nonprofits. Most of them actually talked at some point or another about the positives of these organizations in our communities. One of the former lead of the IRS that he talked to, tax law expert, he gave a lot of concerns with all this stuff, yet he said, these are really questions of how do we best do this to where they're being transparent and there's no issues, because we really need these nonprofits and churches in our communities. So I don't think that concern really held water. And then I would hear people as well, they'd say, Jeff, Nathan and Chris, they started out with bad assumptions. They started out with a negative bias, and then they just incorrectly applied that lens and their bias and their bad assumptions to all churches to try to prove Tex's point. And this whole docuseries is just going to be him trying to prove bad biases. It's not going to be an honest conversation. Now, after watching it, I thought that he approached this pretty thoughtfully and with good questions. And if his biases were completely false, okay, if they were completely false, I think the interviews with the experts would have shown that. I think they would have shown that pretty clearly. Now, at the same time, Nathan definitely has bias. We all have bias, and I don't think he tried to hide kind of where he was coming from and what his thoughts were, but I also thought he showed his work well, and I thought, when he shared why these questions are legitimate questions that are worth asking, I think he listened to people giving answers. And guys, honestly, I think they're more than questions that are worth it. I think these are questions when he asks, I think a lot of these questions are vital questions for all of us to ask. Okay, so kind of here's my takeaway after watching the entire docuseries and sleeping on it a little bit. After watching all 7 episodes, I think the religion business is well worth the watch, and I would highly recommend it to all Christians, all pastors, all church staff, because again, we are not going to agree on everything, but I think these are conversations that need to be had, and I think these are going to make us think just much bigger about the church, okay? Now, some of the content is uncomfortable, and you're probably not going to like it all or agree with everything, but I think the conversations overall are very positive, and they're going to be a big net positive for the church. There's going to be more good that comes from this than bad, in my opinion, if we have the conversations. Now, if we fight and churches hunker down and church leaders hunker down and Christians hunker down more in our shells and say, we're not going to answer these questions, separation of church and state, religious freedom, all of this, if we just keep hiding behind this stuff instead of being transparent above reproach, that won't go well. But I think as long as we're having these conversations, this is going to be a big net positive, and it's going to lead us to all have conversations about not only solutions, but how can we be an above reproach church full of integrity that honors Jesus and draws people to the way of Jesus? So if you have not watched this docuseries yet, I highly recommend it. I think it's well worth the watch. And if you use the link in our description, you can actually get 10% off when you watch it. And when you watch it, let me know what you think. Also, keep a watch out for all of the episode reviews that are coming and join the conversation about each episode once you've watched it or once you've seen the review. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, good, bad, or ugly. I want to hear from you, and I want to hear what you're thinking and how you're receiving this docuseries, questions that you have, concerns you have. I want to hear about it all. But that's just kind of my initial review after watching the whole docuseries. I'm going to go back and I'm going to more slowly over the next week watch every episode and then react to it. So I'll be back soon with my review and reaction of episode 1 of The Religion Business. But until then, see ya. Grace and peace.